Welcome to everybody who has joined us. We are getting ready to start this webinar, and to welcome all our panelists. I'm going to start with a few housekeeping rules and give you a little bit of background to why we decided to do this webinar. We originally decided to do it in the summer, but actually it seems very timely now, as there are working parties, certainly in the UK, discussing this topic, and certainly in the regulatory authorities, about what impact what has happened and how we've resolved it might have on future clinical trials. I am the managing partner of tranScrip, and this is a tranScrip webinar. And most of you probably know us as a sort of specialist service consultancy in pharma. And I'm also Vice President of the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, and we've been having working parties on this topic. So this is of great interest to me, but I am not strictly a panelist. I am a facilitator, so I'm going to do my best not to dominate the conversation, even though it's a topic that I'm very interested in. Just for you to note, the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine will be doing a survey on this topic in next week or the week after it will be launched, just to understand the issues that people are facing and get information back, which will be fed back to ABPI and to MHRA and various other people. So it is extremely timely that we're having this, and I look forward to the discussion. And I know that there are quite a few people from the faculty and so on who are on. And I was asked to mention that the faculty has a number of events around this, but please look at the website and follow them through onto discussion topics there. So today this webinar is hosting a topic that is about the impact of the pandemic of COVID-19 on clinical trials, not just COVID trials, but obviously on all the other activities that we do, why we do the clinical trials, what it means for things like regulatory and evidence for doing deals with other farmers, and whether or not we can actually get started with the clinical trials. So I think this is a very interesting topic because it will feed how we progress running clinical trials in the future. I think all of us are almost certain it will change the way we approach running clinical trial programs and building evidence for registering new drugs. But first, some housekeeping rules, and I need to tell you that this panel discussion is being recorded, and many people that have sent us emails saying they couldn't actually attend the time, so it will be available on our website, and we will circulate the link at the end of the call. The panelists do wish to state that the opinions they express are theirs and not those of necessarily the companies that they represent or the investigators and so on. So please respect that. And as far as the people online are concerned, all the attendees other than the panelists are muted, but we'd love to hear from you in terms of questions. So there is a chat box. Please let us know if you would like a question answered during the discussion. And I see we have almost 100 attendees online already, so welcome. And what we're going to do first is a little poll to actually see what the impact of COVID-19 has had on your clinical trials and your clinical development programs. and you will see that poll coming up now. So just as a icebreaker, let us know whether this pandemic has significantly disrupted one or more trial, somewhat disrupted, minimal disruption, or it's not applicable to you. And if you could vote now, we will wait for a moment and give you a minute to vote, and then we'll go into introducing the panelists and discuss our first topics. So, Ashton, do we have any results?
We do, yes.
Interesting. So we've got quite a lot of people to whom this is not applicable, but of those, most have said that there has been significant or somewhat disruption, which I think is probably what we would expect. Okay, so now let's get into the meat of this, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. I'll start with Charlotte. If you would like to introduce yourself and also tell us what context in terms of the clinical trials and development programs and things this has had for you for COVID-19 and how you've resolved it.
Yes, thank you very much, Flic. Yes, I'm Charlotte Keywood. I'm a pharmaceutical physician with 30 years experience in the business, and for the past 4 years I've been working as head of global R&D at Zambon, which is an Italian-based multinational company. And in the last 4 years, we've been developing a specialty portfolio that's very much orientated towards severe respiratory disease. So severe respiratory infection and inflammation. And we have 3 major programs, which, as you can imagine, being respiratory patients, the COVID could have a significant impact on those. We started a first-in-man phase 1 program at the beginning of this year in a phase 1 unit, and part of that program was in asthma patients as well. So we were faced with amending the protocol in order to change the visit scheduling for that study around the ability of the unit to admit subjects to the unit. And actually they were kept in a bit longer so that they didn't have to make journeys to and from the unit and potentially expose themselves to COVID hazard. And in addition, they had to have COVID testing before they came in and out of the unit. But in fact, the amendments went very well. The trial actually ended slightly quicker than it would have done in the original scheduling. So actually that one worked out very well. We have 2 global phase 3 programs. One of them is in pulmonary inflammation following lung transplantation. And the other one is for non-cystic fibrosis, bronchiectasis. And both of these, of course, are severely ill patients. Now, in order to support these trials, we drew up some sort of guidelines of how we would manage the patients in the trials. We had a COVID plan, and we actually got to this slightly faster than EMA and FDA, and we were gratified to see that when EMA and FDA came out with their preliminary guidances, it was very much in the same line as we thought that in our plan. So we were already quite well aligned, so that was reassuring to know. But some specific problems, I mean, in both studies, in the lung transplant study, we actually suspended recruiting new patients so we could focus on supporting the ones in the trial. And in the bronchiectasis program, in some centres, it was stopped altogether. It was paused for a while and then restarted as the centres reopened. But there was a sort of wave of activity as COVID spread across the globe that affected the different sites at different rates. An interesting one in the lung transplant program, the primary endpoint was being captured by in-hospital visits, and the protocol subsequently been discussed with the health authorities and amended to allow the patients to collect the primary endpoint at home. So we've changed that quite substantially. In the bronchiectasis program, We were fortunate enough insofar as the primary endpoint gets captured by the patient and they don't have to come into hospital in order to have the primary endpoint managed or diagnosed. Nevertheless, that we were worried it could result in underreporting because we're looking in that study for pulmonary exacerbations, and in fact these tend to occur when patients are out and about catching viral infections. They get a pulmonary exacerbation, and if they were shielding, we were somewhat worried in fact that this could impact the occurrence of the primary endpoint. And also the fact that they were shielding and not wanting to go to hospital if necessary might have also encouraged underreporting of the primary endpoint. So we have some concerns around that, and obviously we're going to have we are continually looking at that in a blinded manner. And in fact, as part of that program, we also undertook a blind event rate review to see whether we have the right number of patients according to the number of pulmonary exacerbation events we're getting, to make sure that we didn't have to over recruit and potentially expose more patients to the trial during this period. So a number of logistic difficulties, if you like, but we have actually, I think we've successfully overcome them and are continuing to make good progress on all fronts.
Thank you. That covers a host of things which are quite valuable, which I'm sure we're going to explore later. Miguel, would you like to?
Thank you, Flic, and good afternoon to everybody, the ones on the screen and the ones behind the screen, just over 100, that's great. I'm Miguel Porter, the CEO of Bone Therapeutics. Bone Therapeutics is a cell therapy company using MSC-derived osteoblasts to regenerate bone primarily. We have a couple of assets in clinical trials which have been impacted by the pandemic, very much like what Charlotte said. We had to pause, interrupt, and then reinitiate, and we kind of could see it follow the wave of the pandemics. We stopped in Europe, we stopped in China, then China, Hong Kong initiated first, or reinitiated first, precisely as the pandemic followed. At the same time, we were able during the year to raise, to do a deal, and clearly continue our activities of production and supply to the sites. We've started to do things differently, started to adapt to a new environment, and really, as Charlotte also said, we manage it through. We're kind of waiting to see what it comes, but we've been able to keep our business as an organization for the focus of our patients. I'd like also to point another topic. I also have responsibilities at a couple of organizations that represent the activity in this field, the International Society of Cell and Gene Therapy and the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, where we've been taking position not only on the impact on the clinical trials, but also on the impact of changes with regulations, and the regulators are not only responding to COVID, but how that will then carry on forward, being applicable or not, as we continue to do our business, which I think is what we need to discuss here, in a way, how it impacted us, how we've managed, how do we see this impact carry on forward, hopefully taking the good lessons and applying them to business going forward. I think you're in mute, Flic.
Very useful, thank you. Alastair, do you want to go next? And
Sure, thanks, Flic, and good afternoon. My name's Alistair McKinnon. I'm a UK trained physician surgeon, practiced for 10 years, and then moved by the London Business School to a biotech VC, where I was for 10 years, and then became the CMO and as one of the founders of Mereo, a UK-based biotech. Similar stories to both Charlotte and Miguel. We have two programs, both in orphan diseases, throughout the year, in one in phase 2A and one in phase 2B. The phase 2A study is in a respiratory indication, which has clearly been the most challenging of the two, and we've had the same issues with the pandemic flowing across the world and sites progressively stopping, and that program essentially being on pause for a period of time and then picking up again in the late summer. We weren't recruiting in the Far East, but it started off in Scandinavia, and then Benelux have been very good since that period. Our other indication is osteogenesis imperfecta. So a bone disease, which you might not think is quite so affected, especially as we're in the second half of the study, which is an off therapy period, which is really fortunate because all the patients had gone through their primary endpoint for the treatment phase, and we kept this year for them pretty light. So that was fortunate. The one thing that is true with OI is that severely affected OI patients have bad scoliosis, which affects the lungs, but they also have part of the disease affects the parenchyma of these severe patients as well. So they were reluctant to come in even for the light touch protocol that they had at the time. So in both programs, we undertook a patient-by-patient review of what was realistic in the protocols, and in a way it was advantage of being an orphan that we were able to do that. Similar to Miguel on the company side, we managed to do a fundraising. This was more complicated because our major shareholder previously was Neil Woodford, so we had to totally rebuild a fundraising of solely, which we managed to do with solely US shareholders, none of whom we were previous shareholders of the company. So I think that was a pretty decent achievement to do remotely, and it's been made public that we're in late stages of a significant deal on one of our programs as well. So similar to Miguel, that we've continued to do full remote due diligence at a corporate and a program level.
Thank you. That's really, and that's quite exciting and quite challenging, I think, doing fundraising and deals in an environment we're not really used to doing that. Certainly the investors that I'm speaking to find it quite unusual to be doing that sort of thing via Teams. So interesting. Kevin, do you want to talk to us about some of the interesting ends of the evidence-based side that you've been dealing with?
Sure. So my name is Kevin Carroll. I'm a statistician. I've been a statistician in pharmaceuticals for, over 30 years now. I was formerly the chief statistician for AstraZeneca R&D, but over the last 7 years or so, I've been acting as an independent consultant dealing with small companies and large companies alike. So I have to be a little careful with any examples I cite because of confidentiality, but it's been clear this year that many of the folks I work with have had challenges with COVID, and it's been equally clear that the guidance is provided, and admittedly in a hurry by the authorities, have not really been as clear as maybe companies might like. Quite a bit of room. They're quite vague, and a couple of the, just an idea of a couple of the issues that I've seen in more than one instance is a situation where folks have been close to the end of their trial. They may be in the later phases, and they may still be recruiting, but they've got the majority of patients, and they make a decision that continuing the study through the COVID crisis, where you have impacts on recruitment and your ability to collect data, your ability to see patients, get them to clinic. These issues are such that the sponsor decides that actually it's too messy to continue, and they stop the trial prematurely. Now, we can talk about it a bit more, but there are some serious consequences with that maneuver, not least, for sure the study will be underpowered in your chance of false negative rises. So one needs to think about that kind of approach. And then there's others who have attempted to continue their study even though recruitment's been slowed, patient visits have been stretched out, and new methods for collecting data have to be employed. but they've nonetheless soldiered on to try and keep the study running. Sometimes they may have paused the study, but it's not been closed, and then it reignites later in the year. And there, the issues are that you generate data, or potentially generate data during the COVID period, and then the concerns are, does that then introduce some kind of contamination or dilution when you're trying to compare the treatments in your study? To what extent does that cause bias in the analyses that you're going to do, and consequently mess around the interpretation? And there's various ways that one can try and analyze your data in the light of information having been collected during the period of COVID, and we can talk about those later as well if we wish. But so there's a whole range of actions that sponsors have taken, and I think those that are ones where we stop the trial prematurely, one has to look very carefully at the wisdom of doing that, versus other situations where you try your best to continue or at least pause the study to collect data later, so you don't curtail the trial. And you can introduce additional interims, and other things can take place. People have even considered changing their endpoints and their populations. So you have to be very careful of continuing the study, that at the end of the day, the data can be interpreted, and the maneuvers that you've made have not introduced a bias into the results that will unfortunately lead EMEA and FDA to say, well, you tried to conduct the trial, well, that's great. However, your handling of the data thereafter has resulted in the situation where we can't interpret your results. So it's very challenging, and it's it's made more challenging by the fact that some of the guidances out there aren't really as clear as they maybe could be. And I think in the end, it will be a kind of case-by-case assessment of what is the impact in trial X, Y, and Z. It will almost be a case-by-case evaluation of each one idiosyncratically to see what can and can't be said. And I guess maybe I should pause at that point, and we can always come back to these things as needed.
It sounds like we've got lots of work ahead across pharma to resolve all these things. That is additional work we would not have planned for before. Aaron, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Aaron Dane. I'm also a statistical consultant. So I've been working as a statistician in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry for about 25 years. So I've been working in a number of areas, and one of the areas that I've seen particular challenges is working on trials where it's a relatively short-term treatment. So often someone is hospitalized and will have two weeks of therapy, but then the primary endpoint will be 2 to 4 weeks after that, so after they've been discharged from hospital. So as well as the recruitment challenges, the other issue has been that you can get the data up until the end of therapy, but then the key endpoints of interest, it's very hard to get that data because it often requires samples to be taken, which is very difficult to do when you're in the middle of a pandemic. So what that's meant is that the approaches have been very dependent upon how far through the trial a sponsor is. You know, as Kevin was talking about, if you're near the end, maybe the approach is different than if you're at the very beginning as to what you do next. But some of these areas are not areas where you can necessarily just delay the study for a year because the finances don't allow that to happen. So that could be challenging, and working out what to do then. A lot of this is still ongoing with discussions with the regulatory agencies, so there's no solutions there. But that in itself means that companies are having to continue to run studies at risk and at cost when it's less clear on what the solution will be. So, I mean, that's maybe something we can come back to as well, about what we do in these various cases and other approaches. Some of the ones Kevin mentioned are the same, you know, looking at broader time points, changes of endpoint, all of those sorts of things may be able to help. I suppose the other thing I would add is I agree there's not been clear guidance, and I detect that there's a concern about setting a precedent as well. And that's partly why they're very case by case. But that obviously makes it challenging for each individual sponsor going in and having those discussions.
Okay. No, all very understood, and I think this challenges the whole, you know, we're used to working with a consistency across trials within therapeutic areas much more, not necessarily for Alastair in the rare disease stuff, because there isn't necessarily any precedent for some of those things, but for many of our trials there has been precedent before, and that precedent is all somewhat broken, and that means a lot of work going forward. Karen, last but not least, or very valuable input.
Thank you, Flic. So, hi everyone, my name is Karen Nugent. I've recently joined tranScrip as a senior partner. Prior to that, I've spent 26 years in pharmaceutical companies, biotech, CROs, and have held various levels of roles, in mostly leading clinical development projects and also head of clinical operation roles. So the great thing of being at tranScrip is we're seeing a broad range of challenges with regards to COVID disruption, and with a wide variety of adaptations that have been made, of course putting safety first and data integrity focus. And actually the impact of those amendments that have been made to ongoing clinical trials have had varying amount of impact overall to the development programs. So to give some examples, we had a study running in a clinical trial unit that had to close because they had some staff members who had tested positive for COVID. Unfortunately, we had a study running in that unit that had was tapering off treatment. It was a double-blind study, and because we needed to send patients home as quickly as possible, the right thing to do, unfortunately, was have to break the blind so we could determine who could go home immediately and who had to stay in a little bit longer on an accelerated taper program. Next example is we had to close a study early. As Kevin said, this is probably one of the worst scenarios. However, we got lucky in this case. The study had enrolled 90% of their patients, and it did meet its primary endpoint. So, you know, good success outcome there. Recently also worked on a large phase 3 study that pretty much made every adaptation possible in line with FDA and EMA guidance. Considerable amount of thought and time, and as we all know, clinical trials take up a huge amount of thought and resource, and having to do this on top of everyday work to a trial was challenging. Those adaptations were successful and have allowed us to continue the study. However, the enrolment has really been impacted, and that study is going to cost a lot more than originally budgeted for. And then to end on a final success note with some of our examples, we have working on a COVID program, and we managed to adapt the protocol, so we pretty much made it completely virtual. So IMP shipped to the patient's home, telemedicine, and patient-reported data directly. So that's a good success story of where we are. And I guess my concern of what's happening now and what I deal with is how are we able to document and focus in and make sure that these adaptations have minimal impact on data validity, and that we are documenting them well enough to be able to defend them in the future.
Okay, well, maybe that's a question we should kind of throw back at the various panelists. If you in terms of the impact on the evidence base that I think you mentioned there, Kevin, in terms of regulatory impact, how, apart from lots of work, is this going to disrupt the actual ability to register products on schedule? Are they going to be delayed? Are we going to have issues where things that otherwise might have made the marketplace will no longer get there? Anybody want to
make a comment?
Yeah.
Make a comment. All of the above is the answer, I think. You're going to have medicines that don't make it to market that should have done because the trials were curtailed too soon and they led to false negative findings. And you're also going to have, for those trials that did continue and did try and generate data, you're going to have the great debate is going to be pre and information pre and post COVID. To what extent has the trial been impacted by kind of lack of information post COVID or dilution post COVID? So when you keep the trial going and you try and generate data, when you come to file that, there will be a whole bunch of ad hoc analyses executed, regardless of what the sponsor has put in the SAP. There will be ad hoc analyses executed, most likely by the authorities, who will look to examine themselves the extent to which data collected pre-COVID and post-COVID, can or cannot be combined, and how to interpret the results of a trial which never ever envisaged the fact that you'd have this kind of intervention taking place in the form of COVID. So that review process is likely to take longer. There's likely to be more questions, more issues, more kind of ad hoc analyses, and each case I think will be idiosyncratic. And I think the review process could be drawn out for those trials that conducted and delivered data before, during, and after the pandemic at its peak. So yeah, I do think there's likely to be. It's going to be more difficult to make judgments. As simple as that.
Yeah, I can have, well, I think one thing that we've all seen and happen is delays, right? I mean, we got delays on our studies. They may not have been very significant. They may not be very, very different from some of the delays that happens frequently in clinical trials, but we had to interrupt the studies. And I think that happened across. Different indications will have been impacted differently. And I think the point that Kevin made, all of the above, but not necessarily the same way to all clinical trials and to all products. But we're going to see a florid of this impact. Clearly, the delays we have seen, but I think we've also saw different practices and the interactions with the regulators, namely, and with the sites. And I wouldn't say that all of that is bad, because I think in the end we're going to take advantage of some of those practices, some willingness to do things slightly different, and that will improve the operations of the studies going forward. The issue of missing data, the issue of missing patients, the issue of not being able to, it's going to be probably for me the biggest one, a more difficult one, because it will not be easy to repair. That we'll need to be creative about it, and again interact with the regulators, trying to kind of overcome those challenges.
Yeah,
I think both Alastair and Charlotte, you both mentioned that about constant regulatory interactions. Has that been helpful? I don't know who wants to go first.
yes, I think, I mean, certainly I get a sense from the division we're dealing with, the FDA, that they are open to dialogue. And, they're there, they say they're there to help. When it comes to the end of phase 3 meeting or the actual review, we'll see what happens. But I wanted to go back to Karen's point. I think that documentation, really good documentation is key. Documenting why you did something real time, and then when you come to present the data in the future, you can see exactly why things were done in a certain way, and that helps justify the action. Really bearing in mind, of course, that the objectives in continuing the trials is to ensure patient safety and data integrity. And I think if you've documented all those processes and what you've done to try and ensure those, to continue to ensure those, is really key, and will form an important basis of the discussion with regulators when you come to file.
Yeah, and I agree with that. We've done that as well, and particularly involving the DMC on each study earlier too. I guess going back to the regulators, there is the nervousness of what will happen later on, given the guidelines were all absolutely right, safety first, and then here's a lot of ideas that you might like to think about. But the nervousness of leaving it with the FDA up to each division, we know that they behave very differently division to division, and some will be more open to these things than others. I think without bit more concrete, the later stage you are in development, that you're going to get increasingly more nervous about how you'll be treated at that point. And one of the few things you do have is what Charlotte said, which is the documentation involving people, not just what you've done internally, but with the DMC and others as well, to justify what you've done, because there is a concern that memories end up a bit short, and the data we have will be the data we have, and that won't be able to change very much.
And it may be that you're dealing with a different group of people than you are. So if you're having a conversation with, say, FDA or EMA at the moment about your program, when you come to file, it might be a different team, and they may not be the same people looking at it. So not only they don't have the memory, they weren't having the conversation in the first place as well.
And some divisions will have a much more acute feeling for the issue that COVID is presenting than others. The respiratory division being the obvious one, who will have been inundated on both sides with new trials for COVID as well as changes to the other studies.
Yeah.
Definitely. The other thing I was going to add, it relates to the chance of approval and delay, is that even the other thing that can happen is that because the COVID pandemic has hit different places at different times, you might end up with trials with an overage of patients from a certain region, which could have potential impacts on approval in the US, for example, or something like that. So again, that's something that would need to be agreed with agencies. So on one hand, you can keep the trial running, but you end up with more patients from a certain region of the world than you originally intended, and what that does to your global approvals.
I think that's a very good point. But I think what's coming over loud and clear is that memory and communication and keeping the dialogue going, regardless of whether you're recruiting patients or not, seems to be very important. And I think our experience, I think Karen, has been that the agencies have been open to things that we've not had very much of before, like picking up the phone, or setting up a very brief Teams meeting with people just to ask very relatively simple questions. You know, how do we approach this? Which we'd never have done before.
Yeah, it's quite refreshing.
I can tell you, I mean, it was again COVID related, but we were able to get a scientific advice in 2 weeks from picking up the phone and sitting down, or not sitting down, but connecting with them at the distance. So there was the willingness to make things happen. But I agree, I mean, once the urgency disappears, what will remain from what we've done? And I think that's what everybody's also saying.
Yeah. I'm going to suggest, Ashton, that we do the next poll, which is about the level of concern for disrupted trials with regard to data validity and regulatory, which applies to all of these. So I think if you could vote in the next minute, and then on this, whether you think you're significantly concerned, somewhat concerned, not too worried, or not applicable. And then what we're going to do, I think, is to talk about what this actually will mean for things going forward, and hopefully there'll be lots of positive discussion as well as practical issues around what we do in trials that we're going to do in the future. And so if you've all voted, whether we've got any results on that to see how people feel. Somewhat concerned. I think people are concerned, and I do think that this memory and communication and documentation is all absolutely critical. Karen, there was one question on the questions that I didn't address before, which is about handling the IMP in remote trials and validating dispensing, asking how that is approached in a fully remote study.
I mean, I think if you look at the EMA guidance, they give some very good pointers on how to ship IMP directly to patients. Of course, all the usual apply, so making sure that the patient's confidentiality remains sound, and that the contract is very specific about that with the courier. And, you know, making sure that any temperature,
Karen, Flic, I think we've lost your sound. We can't hear you. Karen, I do have a question here for you, which I'm just going to ping over in the question box. I wonder whether you could answer that for us.
Okay, yeah.
So the question is, have the statisticians had to resort futility analysis in order to reach rapid decision for COVID treatments?
So what I've seen is that there is more of a thought and an ability to look at interim data. So whether that's blinded or unblinded, but both would be possible. But I think the fact is that if you're looking at unblinded data, then all of the usual rules would apply in terms of making sure you don't inflate the type 1 error. Futility analyses would be possible, but actually, I mean, for futility, that's not so different from what you do normally. So unless you've got a quite strong signal that it's not going to work, you wouldn't necessarily stop. So there has been more discussion of reviewing the data at this point because the studies are halted. But actually, you'd still have to have all the considerations you would normally do in terms of making sure you do that in the right way, and you set up the rules as to when you're going to stop. I mean, Kevin, I don't know if you've had any different experiences of doing this.
So just to reiterate the question, it was, I think you said, have the statisticians considered futility analyses for in trials of COVID treatments? Is that correct? So you're talking about trials in which potential therapies for COVID are being evaluated. That's what the question sounded like. Or did I mishear it? Can you just say the question again to make sure we understand its intent?
Yeah, of course. We've got, have the statisticians had to resort futility analysis in order to reach rapid decision for COVID treatments? So it's an example here of hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, okay, so I was right. It's about treatments for COVID. So I'm involved in 6 separate trials for agents for COVID. 2 of them, one as an IDMC member, one as an IDMC chair, and the other 4 separate trials for design. And no, I wouldn't encourage the use of futility analyses in any trials to evaluate treatments for COVID, because the issue isn't necessarily, so many of these trials are not really necessarily that large, and you run the risk with a futility analysis that you could discard a promising agent in error too soon. So I think it's more appropriate to do interims to look for efficacy than it is to look for no efficacy. And the trials typically are quite short. Trials in COVID are typically quite short. So it's more sensible, I think, to be looking in those studies for early signs of marked evidence of efficacy, so that then they can be accelerated. Futility, you run the risk of, because you may not know how a given therapy is going to pan out. You may think you do, but you don't. And if you do an early futility, you run the risk, if you don't really understand the time course of development of efficacy, of potentially discarding, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend futility analyses in studies to evaluate therapies for COVID. Is what I would say.
Yeah, and apologies, I was answering a different question. Thanks, Kevin. I suppose what I would add to that as well, the challenge with COVID studies is because they are so short, it's actually understanding where an interim is going to fit so that you actually get a decision from your interim analysis before you've completed the study anyway. So there's often a logistical question about when can you make a meaningful decision, and can you make that decision before the end of the study?
I'm guessing the next topic would be about how we will adapt future clinical trials to improve on trial resistance. I mean, we've made lots of adaptations to our ongoing trials in a well-constructed way. But with hindsight, what would we do for future clinical trials to optimise resilience?
Yeah, I can start because I think there are different buckets that we can organize that. One is the way we do things, and just see. I mean, we're still a bit struggling with technology here, but everybody's a lot more familiar with technology nowadays, and we do this all the time now. And I think that's doing that and applying that to the way we do the clinical trials going forward is, I think it's a must. We were able to get CTA's approval, starting some sites. We were able also to get a scientific advice. We did all the business at the distance. So I think that's a learning going forward. Another bucket is regulatory changes. There were some temporary measures that the regulators took to allow approval and moving on with the studies. I'll give you one specific example in our field, in cell and gene therapy. There was a waiver regarding GMO regulations across Europe, which has always been a challenge for us to do studies in this field across Europe. I think that if we could do it then, maybe we can learn and take that into going forward and adapting and flexibilizing or making it more flexible, the rules going forward. So that's another one. And then maybe the last one, I leave also to Aaron and Kevin to comment. I mean, maybe, and definitely Charlotte, maybe in terms of the designs of the studies, in terms of the analysis, in terms of data capture, in terms of bringing it more to real life and adapting to the challenges of today and taking that into how can we make things easier going forward. I think there's also a learning that we can take in for the studies going and making it easier for us. Because in the end, it will be easier for the patients, and that's after all what we wanted to do.
I think. Can you hear me again now?
Yeah.
After rebooting my computer, I think you're right. I think this is a very disruptive influence, isn't it? And we're going to have to re-examine how rigid we might be and how also we interact with agencies going forward. I do remember MHRA in the late 90s when there was a huge rash of guidance documents saying that actually we really didn't want to be straitjacketed by clinical trial design that remained the same pretty much for everything we could think of in similar indications. It gives you a benchmark to work from in terms of a platform, but maybe those restrictions are quite challenging that we have put in place through ICH, through E9 and everything else. I don't know, does anybody want to come back on that?
Yes, I mean, I think it's, this is potentially a great opportunity because I think we have got ourselves into this quite traditional mold of, it's phase 3, 2 double-blind, placebo-controlled, p less than 0.05, confirmatory trials. And that just tells us about a very artificial clinical trial construct and actually doesn't tell us so much about, is the patient really benefiting? And I do think that, the design of clinical trials is long overdue, a bit of an overhaul, and I think this could be an opportunity to do that. And then also taking into account the ability, the new availability of things like wearables, home monitoring. We can get a more real life patient clinical experience of a new therapy. So I think we should try and exploit these opportunities. Miguel was saying, of course, that people now are much more familiar with technology, much more used to using it, smartphones, whatever. So I think now is a really good time to be introducing these and get a more holistic view of evaluating patient efficacy and safety.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would agree that all of that would be really useful, important information. One of the key challenges from a statistical side is to make sure you don't get more missing data, and that missing data is somehow biased. So part of it would, but that's not to say it shouldn't be done. It's more to say that we would have to make sure we had the processes in place to collect the sort of data that's being discussed in a consistent way, so that we don't have that problem of interpretation. So that would just be part of setting up a new system, would be to cover those sorts of issues.
Yes, and I think going forward, there might be lots of things we look at in terms of trials. I mean, frequently we put in, when we're writing protocols, trial windows that are almost impossible to adhere with in normal life anyway, let alone during a COVID episode. And you know, perhaps we should be looking at more outcomes that are not directly related to specific time points exactly in the same way. And Aaron, you do lots of antibiotic studies, and we have a habit of saying, you know, we have to do 5 to 7 days, and then we have to do 4 to 6 weeks, and it has to be within that window. And that assumes all patients recover at the same speed. You know, it doesn't necessarily tell us the answer. And I think perhaps, and I wondered, looking at others around the panel, whether the fact that we've not been able to do those challenges, do we really understand the diseases we're looking at? Now, the time points that we put in, really, do they really parallel the disease, or do they parallel what we'd like to fit in with designing our trial so that it's realistic to get the data in?
And I suppose my observation from the antibiotic studies, it's probably a bit of both. So in some ways, there's part of it where there's in the studies Flic's referencing, you often need to test that the antibiotic has worked after you've stopped taking it. So basically, there is still a minimum period you need to define before you follow up. Otherwise, you don't get that true assessment. But whether you need the window at the other end, the long end, is a good question. You know, is that something we've just got used to doing because we always have a plus or minus window with a lot of these things? So I can see that there are components that could be looked at, but there are still some things that probably are critical to a certain area that we may not be able to move around so much.
And I think from I think E2 risk assessment just becomes even more important. So it's thinking about what we want to achieve. So what are our objectives? What are our estimates? Do we understand them? And then, you know, working backwards to why do we need to do that, and how that will reflect and push on how we do it. So, you know, for example, just giving options so that we can maintain our primary endpoint data and critical data. So identifying that and making sure that we have options so that we have as few missing data as we possibly can achieve the trial, I think is important.
I'll just make a quick comment, Kevin. The fundamental question we were asking at the start of this piece was, how will future trials, what has occurred during the heat of the pandemic, how would that affect future trials, for example, begin next year, initiated next year, for example. And in the end, in terms of how, I think there'll be some impact in how data are collected, the manner in which visits are executed, the manner in which data are collected. And as long as whatever we do applies equally to all arms in a trial without differential, then I personally don't care how it's done. You can collect the data on stone tablets, or you can collect the data you know, electronically, remotely, however you want to do it. As long as it's collected in a fashion which avoids the potential for bias, then you're good. And as long as those methods are attempting to maximise the amount of information you collect, leaving holes in your trial.
We are now going to move on to the last poll of the webinar, and the question is, how confident are you that our industry will drive forward change and adapt to ensure trial resilience for future disruptions? If you could all vote now. So the results show that between those that feel highly confident and those who feel somewhat confident, the industry is optimistic that we can adapt and overcome future disruption to ensure trial resilience.
I think we're learning to deal with the unexpected as we're doing here. But I think like we've done it before, I think we need to take the right lessons and improve them going forward. And I appreciate the discussion we had together. And I think we need to try to capture it, even in writing or something, just to kind of get us to think, how can we impact things? Charlotte said something very good. This is a disruptive moment. Let's take the lessons and apply them going forward.
Aaron?
Yeah, I would echo that, and I guess some of this we've got some learnings, but in my experience, some of this is still happening, and we're still learning, and we're still having the discussions, and I think that's going to continue and evolve over probably the next 6 months or so, as well as different areas get affected and different therapy areas get affected as well.
Charlotte?
Yeah, no, I would concur with my colleagues, and then to quote, I think it was Winston Churchill, I think we should never let a good crisis go to waste, so we need to capitalise on it.
Well said. And Alastair?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that as well. I mean, it's going to be a very fast period of evolution that we'll go through because of this. I know on the corporate side, talking to people, someone was commenting about how their work changing. They think they're going to achieve something in 3 months that they thought they were going to do in 3 years. So it really can change timelines.
And Kevin?
Yeah, we have said, most people have said what has to be said, but in a brief summary, I think trial design remains absolutely critical. You have to have good, with or without COVID, your trial design has to be good. You need to maximize your data collection and minimize your patient loss. Whatever activities that you can do to do that should be allowed. And we need to get the regulatory authorities to consider levels of evidence, especially in situations where trials have been badly disrupted, because it can't be correct to use the same level of evidence to assess a trial that would not have been impacted by COVID or a trial that has been impacted by COVID due to patient loss, for example, loss of data. The levels of evidence required cannot logically be the same in those situations. Yeah, and that also applies to future trials where you may have to look at subsets of patients who were or were not previously affected by COVID. So there's some more work to be done on the side of the authorities to consider carefully the real impact when it comes to data review of this COVID crisis, because right now I don't think they are considering all of the important aspects, only some have been considered.
On behalf of tranScrip, just want to thank the panellists very much for all their time and the deep thought that's gone into this. We know the work it takes to do something like this. We look forward to continuing the discussion with you all in future webinars, and also to say thank you to all of the many attendees that sat through our discussion. We hope you found it very useful, and we do apologise for the technical issues, which are just a sign of the times right now that we're going to have to live with, I'm afraid. So thank you all very much, and we'll close the webinar. Thank you.